Contacts, I asked. Genetics, man, bilang के device. They spoke of influence of Bachchan having come one time to Claremont. After a while, I couldn't follow. The wind had risen again, playing with the zinc. The intonations were too fast, drunk. Still, the situation was effortless. I couldn't have been in it in India, no chance. And standing at the open back of the lumberyard, the sleeper logs in proximity, looking out into the fields with the feeling of travelling Indian railways, the great Gangetic sweep, a country palpable, unknowable. It was hours when the rain tapered to a drizzle left. We were going to Bunny's. The night was fresh and silhouetted, Crapo was singing tenor. The wind lifted the smell of wet paddy from the fields, faintly like asafoetida. He passed the house across the bleachers. Who lived in there, I asked. Churai lived in there. Sure, Churai. At Bunny's, the night was ending. The room was thick with alcohol and chat. Bush rum yielded to 5-year. Fairy lights were wound around the safety hill. I couldn't tell if left over from the valley or in anticipation of Christmas. Against the dim lighting, they made the mood of a finished occasion. The sound system issued old Hindi film music, of longing, of suppression, the idea of what it is to love, what it is to lose, Indian fatalism. I looked around me, middle-aged Guyanese men in caps, t-shirts and short straightforward mustaches. They tried rice in the morning, brewed bush rum, sold timber, worked the post office, or who knows, done nothing or picked fights. And now they were happy and they were sad, and the world was loaded with a thing you could not touch. Hey buddy, jam the mic, we get it in Jaman here, someone said, and they were singing. Suhani Raat Dhal Chuki, obscure non-Hindi film classics 40-50 years old. A man called Jabilal sang. He was joined by a few others from their spots. I watched, mesmerized. To sing in a language one didn't know, it seemed to me an act of devotion. The half-baked, heartfelt, purified delivery, I felt it in my bones. Here up, brother, Jabilal said to me after. Rafi, you ain't got to understand words. Rafi in the blood. And Kishore, I asked, a great man, but you're open. When Rafi sing a dance song, you dance. When he sing a sad song, you cry. When he sing a love song, woman get fever. Rafi get inside of you, he become you, and you become him. He went to a line from Suhani Raat. Tarap rahe hai hum yahan, tumhare intezar mein. Hear how he play with the syllable, make 10 from 1. Now that is feeling. You know what it means, I asked? Part, but I feel it, my brother, I feel it. Let me tell you one story. When I was in school, I get suspended one time. Because why? Because in the patriotic song, I replaced Guyana with India. I was spent the night at Chabilal's. The mile to his house, we walked and sang. Kishore, upon my insistence, Ye Dila Hota Bechara and the earth, under the wetting stars, the floating drizzle. These songs, these fields, in one of these houses, a body in a damp bed.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all here, and thanks to Dr. Jonas for that very warm welcome, and to Moray to be with Rahul. Rahul and I first met, I think, 2 or 3 years ago in London. I had already read his book and been impressed with how sensitive and truthful it was, and then I met the man, and I was truthful he is, and also kind of jealous by how well he does the Creolese, better than I could, in fact. So it's just really lovely to be here with you. My book is a narrative history. In other words, it has a storyline, and it's a pretty classic and clean storyline. It's structured as a journey, or a series of journeys, actually. Kuli Woman reconstructs the journey of my great-grandmother from India to Guyana in 1903. And it traces the journeys of indentured women as a group, really, their psychological as well as their physical journeys. But it's also a personal journey that begins in Kanji in 1981, the moment my family left for the US as immigrants. The book ends with my returning to Guyana as both a reporter and a researcher. My relationship with the country over the last couple of years has gone through interesting transformations. It started out as kind of nostalgia, perhaps even disappointed nostalgia, and it's become something much more meaningful as I've come back again and again. I've formed relationships, new connections, new friendships, and I see some friends here, so thank you all for coming out, and thanks for your support. This is actually the last stop on my book tour. I've been traveling now 4 to 6 months with the book. I've gone to Delhi, Toronto, London, Calcutta, several places in the US, and it just seems very fitting that I'm ending it right here in Guyana, where this story began. So I'm going to read a couple of passages from the book. I've forgotten my pointer, excuse me. And I've got some lovely archival images for you too. The first passage, well, for some background, you would need to know that my great-grandmother left India 4 months pregnant, and she was traveling by herself. She didn't have a husband with her, and this was in fact the story of most of the women who left India as indentured laborers. 2/3 of them, over the entire course of indentureship, were traveling without a husband. So this first passage is set in Garden Reach, which is the neighborhood in Calcutta where the immigrant depots were located and where the indentured waited for ships to take them to a new world. I tried to imagine my great-grandmother in this setting, preparing to board the Clyde in 1903. How did she ever get to this point of departure, surrounded by so many fragmented families and outcasts, bearing secrets and unstated loss? Did she look back over her shoulder as she boarded the ship? Was there regret in her glance? I don't know, because she didn't say. But I do know the story of one woman who had no regrets when she left Garden Reach in 1916. Maharani could not remember her parents' names by the time she told her story in a voice frail with age. She was a child when they died. They weren't there for her wedding to a much older man, whose name she couldn't remember either. Maharani was 5 when she got married, and she was still just a child, only 12 when widowed. Soon after, her brother-in-law took her to a magistrate's office, where she ceded the rights to her inheritance from her husband. For 8 years after his death, she cooked and cleaned for her in-laws, bearing their beatings for minor mishaps, much like the one that ultimately triggered her journey to Trinidad. She left literally over spilled milk. Maharani had just boiled milk for her in-laws when a cat crept up to lick the pot. She pelted the cat fell over, and the pot capsized. Anticipating another thrashing and suddenly unwilling to accept one, she slipped out while her in-laws were eating. In 1987, Maharani explained why she fled. I said I'm going to beat me because I getting too much licks. I said I'm going to beat me. Well, I run. I didn't tell nobody I'm leaving. On the road later that night, she met a man with 1 foot at a well. When he heard her predicament, he offered to help. Did she want a job on an island where she could make 25 cents a day? All she would have to do, he claimed, is sift sugar. Did she want to go? Maharani said yes. She did want to go. She would go. Minahavnatin, she said, recalling how at 20 she calculated the costs and benefits of leaving India. I come way, Minahavnatin. As her boat was anchored in the Hooghly River, another ship pulled in, bringing home Indians who had finished their indentures. They clamored to portholes to warn the immigrants staring back out of their own portholes. From a distance, the repatriates shook their hands, gesturing for the immigrants not to go. But it was too late for anyone to heed that message. This was the point when the umbilical cord connecting the immigrants to India was presumably cut. Several survivors of indenture, in the rare accounts that describe the severing, mention weeping. They conjure a scene of breastfeeding and wailing as the ship embarked. But Maharani did not cry, nor did she remember sounds of sorrow. She remembered drumbeats. Looking back across the span of 7 decades, she described how her jahajis, her shipmates, played drums provided by the crew and how they sang and danced during the journey. Them bringing happy, them in bringing no trouble, them bringing happy, Nobody to study nothing. That's why I'm burning happy. There was nobody to make her study a single theme. Nobody to cause her grief or worry. No brother-in-law to cheat her, no mother-in-law to beat her. Nobody, she thought, to make her tremble in fear any longer. But should Maharani have been so convinced that no one would cause her grief anymore? The warning by the repatriates as her ship got ready to leave the Hooghly was ominous. Might they have been warning about the voyage itself to begin with? Indenture vessels were, after all, crossing in the wake of slavers with their well-documented horrors, from tragic mortality rates to the rape of women. So this second section is set on the seas during the crossing from Calcutta to the Caribbean, and it's based on my analysis of 77 indenture voyages to British Guyana. Whenever a ship docked, the chief immigration agent at its destination had to report on its passage from India. Some of these dispatches, including the one detailing my great-grandmother's voyage, have been destroyed. Those that survive pull back the screen, if only for brief moments and partial views, on the lives of the women aboard. It is hard in these glimpses to escape the angle of sexual exploitation by figures of all ranks and races. In these archives of misconduct, the women appear resisting advances, or giving in to them, or in the eyes of many ship officials, hoarding them. But the records also provide other views of the women, on deathbeds, giving birth, losing children, going mad, being driven to suicide, engaged in infanticide, rejecting or being rejected by shipboard husbands, demanding that husbands prove themselves, stowing away, crying, cursing, possibly in love, and clearly in anguish. I cannot imagine that the journey was anything but a saga, even for immigrants whose lives aboard passed relatively without incident. Seasickness afflicted most. A majority fell ill with mumps, measles, dysentery, bookworm, or fever. The ache for home was so sharp that one ship surgeon declared, "I know that many die from nostalgia, pure and simple. The excitement of the newness of everything keeps them up for a time, but soon dies away, and is followed by depression when they realize what they have done." The realization must have dawned slowly, as the sea lengthened and the conditions aboard affected them one by one, as blankets rough as jute, sometimes rotten and foul-smelling, caused pus to form on children, as the fans for circulating air were shut down at night when most needed, as the condenser to make the water potable broke, which it routinely did, and as the floor beneath them sweated. All the while, surgeons prepared their balance sheets of births and deaths, recording Shiva's unending dance without realizing it. The Hindu god who destroys in order to create, who dances in a ring of flames to maintain the universe's ceaseless cycle of creation and destruction, did not forget the cargo hold. I'm referring to something far more metaphysical than birth or mortality rates. Hear a woman born on a ship to the West Indies in 1888. On that mad ocean, when all was tossing, people's heads were spinning, and then labor pains started for Ma to have her child. On that mad ocean, I was born. On that mad ocean, I came to life. She was describing her own origins, but with her incantatory words, she could have been telling the creation story of our people, mine and hers. She could have continued in her voice of myth. In our beginning, there was a boat. On that mad ocean, we came to life. We passed the Black Sea to reach the Red. The water was blue before it was green, and then it was mud. We crossed 7 seas, 7 shades of water, shades of darkness and light, light that died and darkness that was born, darkness somehow extinguished and light rekindled. The captain's wheel became Shiva's fiery circle, turning and turning in its cosmic spiral. And in the gyrating of the gales and the churning of the waves, as one steered and the other danced, we became new. The moorings of caste had loosened. and people who had left behind uncles, sisters, husbands, and mothers substituted shipmates, their jahajis, for kin. Unraveled, they began, ever so slowly, to spin the threads of a novel identity. Indentured ships were not slave ships, but there can be no denying a few ties that should have bound the 3 million Africans trafficked by the British as slaves and the million Indians transported as coolies. The people in the hold in both cases were cut from the same demographic, mainly young and overwhelmingly male. Women were in short supply and subject to sexual exploitation during both crossings. And both journeys were transformative, signaling a break with the past, making whatever came before it seem almost as unimaginable to later generations as time and space before the Big Bang. In the beginning, there was a boat. Having emerged from its belly, as survivors, the indentured Indians could no longer be who they had been. Like the slaves before them, they were an entirely new people, forged by suffering, created through destruction. In this sense, above all else, theirs was a middle passage, marked by brutal reinvention. How do I even begin to situate my great-grandmother in this odyssey? If I draw an imaginary line from moment to moment on the ships, from glimpse to glimpse of women aboard, will her shape emerge, constellation-like? Could the wrong shape emerge if I connect the wrong moments to each other? How do I know which are right? Will her constellation give off light? So the next section lands her in Guyana in 1903. The only thing you'll need to know is that Vrijheid's Lust, translated from the Dutch, means liberty's delight, which a lot of you probably already know. The moon was full the first night Sujaria spent in Georgetown. The next afternoon, the agricultural show opened at the Promenade Gardens with a performance by the band of the British Guyana Militia. On display was the colony's harvested wealth, varieties of sugarcane, coffee, rice, plantains. If the newspaper ads were accurate, there were electric lights, refreshments, and al fresco suppers, all for the price of 1 shilling. But that genteel world would not be my great-grandmother's. In her world, 1 shilling was the value of a human life. It was the amount the government docked from the pay of ship surgeons whenever a coolie died during the crossing. 1 shilling was also the wage promised to indentured men for a day's work, though planters habitually broke the promise through a sleight of hand, measuring a day's work not in hours but in tasks, quote-unquote daily tasks that could rarely be done in just 1 day. Women were promised less, 2/3 a shilling for a day's work. This was to be Sujari's world. Like the larger world, it did not treat women equally, and it often did not treat immigrants, whatever their gender, justly. But it was also a world where women were the scarcer sex. There were 64 women per 100 men. 64 women per 100 men on Guyana's plantations. To a woman alone, with a newborn to support, what must this world have looked like? What possibilities and what terror did it hold? Did Sujaria sense that the shortage of women could have dark implications? How did she weigh her options for survival? Was there hope of freedom or power? And what would be the source? Exactly what kind of a new world would this be? If she had turned to the landscape for answers, it might have raised her expectations. The planters had given fanciful names to the sugar estates along the coast, investing them perhaps with their own desires. The train that transported Sujaria to her plantation chugged through industry, triumph, success, and liberty's delight. I wonder what she made of bachelor's adventure as it came into view. Did anyone tell her that was the name of the village's slave descendants, or translate its meaning for her? What ideas might such a name have given the British overseers, mainly single young men who had worked there when it was a plantation? Against the usual expectations, Sujaria reached paradise before she reached hope along the coastal railway line. And then finally she arrived at a plantation with a less whimsical name. Enmore was christened after the parish in England where its first owner had been born 150 years earlier. The plantation was among the colony's largest, as well as one of its most stable and successful. When slavery was abolished, estates across Guyana were abandoned or auctioned, claimed by wild bush or new owners. But Enmore survived for more than a century as the property of one family. With Sujaria, as she descended at its railway station 15 miles east of the capital 7 decades after slavery's end, was the couple she had befriended on the Clyde. By then, Enmore's owners had become absentee. A photograph taken outside its great house in 1876 suggests grandeur in scale and style. Brick pillars with ivy crawling up their sides hold the house aloft, some 20 feet off the ground. Posed in front are a dozen white men, defying the tropical weather with full suits, waistcoats, pocket watches, cravats, top hats politely off their heads. Mostly the men are overseers. One stretched out on a blanket, his face full and fleshy, his eyes alight, his hair wavy and slightly tousled, has some color in his cheeks. Is his pose entitled and cocky, or just at ease? Is he sunburnt? Or is his face red with liberty's delight? In the photograph, there are wives, but not enough. Puffed out in high-collared frilly regalia, 4 women sit. They include the manager's mother-in-law, Sarah, her bronze skin the sign of an earlier era, when black or colored mistresses often, quote, looked after the comfort of her master generally, as a Guyana sheriff once put it. At the time, people may also have looked askance at her apparent marriage to the plantation's engineer, James Cook. Starting in the 1850s, steamships had made travel between England and Demerara faster, bringing in more British wives and would-be wives, and making their relationship much less accepted. But there James stands behind Sarah in the photograph. Huddled in the shadows of the great house, receding into the background, are 2 Indian men. Oddly, a third stands with the main group. He wears simple clothes and appears to be holding something indistinct and furry, held out in front of him as if for the camera. Is it a miniature pet dog, that indispensable accessory for fashionable Victorian ladies? Is it a poodle being presented for posterity by its own personal attendant, but blurred by its own wriggling? Even photographs leave questions. I think I'll stop there. Thank you. So we are happy to take questions, but first I have one for Rahul. One thing I think that our books have in common is some confusion about genre. Some people think my book is a novel, and some readers have mistaken his for a memoir. At least in my case, there's a deliberate blurring of the line between fiction and nonfiction. In Sly Company, there are characters who we recognize from the news, Roger Khan, for instance. And in the excerpt you just read, I believe the letter about Afro-Dulaha and Afro-Dulahin was an actual letter to the editor. So my question is, were you deliberately trying to create some confusion about exactly what kind of book this was, fiction? Wait, I guess yeah. So was it deliberate, and what were you trying to achieve?
Yes, I think it was deliberate. Though I think I didn't realize the extent of confusion of my cause. And I wonder if I would have done things differently if I did. I'm not sure. But basically there are 2 aspects to it. One is the use of memoir. I was very keen on this because maybe it was an anxiety of believability, of personality. I wanted everybody who read this book to think that every word written in it is things that actually happened. I wanted that friction of intimacy. I wanted it to feel like an intimate book, where it gets this close to the subject. And intimacy is losing in some ways, always. I think it was gesturing at certain things. I think I was always gesturing at it's a book of encounters. I wanted the encounters to carry an energy, but also, as we've seen, as in the way the colonial project unfolded in the Caribbean, encounters which created energy, but also a great deal of friction between communities, between genders, between individuals. So that was at the backbone of my work, when I thought it was a natural theme to explore, and I feel novels work through resonance and echoes. That was one aspect of it. Perhaps I was also trying to gesture towards something like what Martin Barter said, all are involved. I wanted to implicate the narrator in this. I wanted to manipulate him, and so that all are involved. Then what does that? All may or may not be considered, they are all involved. So that was a vice or unvice, I don't know, but I wanted the device to memoir. Sort of slightly separate from this is the use of journalistic technique and non-fiction material. Songs, newspaper reports, accounts of real life people like Roger Khan, mixed in with fictional characters or characters who are developed from life but who take their own life on the page and not necessarily based on models but from general observation and looking at circumstances of people. And I realized this could be confusing. I think I took permission from writers. I think I read Dr. back then when I was in Guyana, a book which famously uses historical characters and plays with them. And Dr. who afterwards said in an interview that I just look for a reliable source for the lie I'm about to make up, and then I discover that it's not a lie, it's just that someone else has thought of it before. Or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the great Marquez, peace be upon him,